A38 Valiant was a British prototype tank designed during the Second World War. It was intended to be a lightweight but heavily armored tank for use in the Far East, but proved to be one of, if not the most spectacular failures in the world of armored vehicles. And that's why it's the topic of today's episode of War Machines: Ascendancy of the Terrible. Designed in 1943 and built by Rustin and Hornsby, the only example ever built was constructed in 1944. The 27-ton tank was 5.4 meters long, 17 foot 7 inches, had a width of 2.8 meters, 9 foot 3 inches, and a height of 2.1 meters, 7 feet even. It was crewed by 4 men. It had 114 millimeters, 4.5 inches of armor, and was armed with one QF 6-pounder gun, 57 millimeters, and two 7.92 millimeter Besa machine guns. It was powered by one 210 horsepower GMC 6004 diesel engine. Its suspension was made up of individually sprung units. It had an operational range of 130 kilometers, 80 miles, and a top speed of 19 kilometers an hour on road, 12 miles an hour, and 11 kilometers an hour off-road, 7 miles an hour. The tank was designed to be an assault tank, falling into the infantry tank designation that the British used, and was the spiritual successor to the Valentine. It was designed to have the thickest armor possible while still being a fairly lightweight vehicle. The A38 Excelsior was built with a similar mindset, though the Valiant was nearly 13 tons lighter. The Valiant had the same 114 millimeters of frontal armor as the Excelsior at only 27 tons, and in that way it did achieve its goal. But to do this, other compromises had to be made, and it was these that were the tank's undoing. The design was the culmination of the depths that the British tank industry had fallen to, and as Sir David Fletcher called it, when referring to the things that had to be done to save weight, he said it was a, quote, terrible price for the weight concessions, and it led to one of the worst British tanks ever built during the Second World War. The brief of December 1943 called for 3 prototypes of a small, heavily armored tank for use in the Far East, and since the British didn't strike the same goal that the Americans had with the M4 Sherman, that worked everywhere, the tank could be designed specifically for this environment. Because of this intended area of operation, the speed across open country was less important, as was the performance against other tanks, as the Japanese weren't known for using heavily armored tanks like the Tiger. Design work began with Vickers, but they must have realized that the design was a dumpster fire waiting to happen, so they passed it on to Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon, who also passed it on. These two companies must have had enemies in Rustin and Hornsby, because the design showed up on their doorstep. Rustin and Hornsby built the only prototype in 1944. Vickers was going to use parts from its Valentine tank to give it parts commonality with a fairly numerous design, but this didn't survive the production choices of the other manufacturers, and so died perhaps the only redeeming factor of the design. It turned out, however, that this may have been to its benefit, as the Valentine's running gear specifically was not strong enough to be compatible with the heavy armor. Though why none of the manufacturers decided to make the parts compatible with, one of the most successful tanks on the Western Front, the M4 Sherman, or any other British tank, or American tank, or really any Allied vehicle at all, I don't know. The largest point of commonality was the 210 brake horsepower GM 6004 two-stroke diesel, which was in later versions of the Valentine. Like the Matilda, the Valiant was constructed with large cast armor pieces bolted together. Suspension was 6 equally sized road wheels on each side with independent wishbone suspension units for each wheel, rather than the more common bogies of the time. Concern was expressed about the fragility of these wheels in combat, but since the Valiant was never tested seriously off-road, it turned out to be a non-issue. The drivetrain was located in the rear. The low power of the tank limited it to a predicted top speed of 12 miles an hour, though this was about typical for infantry tanks, which weren't really supposed to be faster than the average infantry unit could march. Following the later Valentine 8 and 9 models, the turret accepted either the QF 6-pounder or the QF 75mm with space for a turret crew of 3, those being commander, gunner, and loader. This was achieved at the cost of a positively massive turret with near vertical faces and a massive cast front face with large bolts, i.e. not what you want on a tank because it's going to get shot. And if it does get shot, you're going to have bolts flying all over the turret. It's going to be a fun time. Not even sure what that voice was. But seriously, you know what this turret looks like? The mantlet was internal and a weak point against accurate close-range fire. The suspension was tested by the Fighting Vehicle Proving Establishment, FVPE, at Chertsey in May 1945. The first day gave minor problems and was abandoned after only 21 kilometers, 13 miles of easy on-road driving. However, the driver was already exhausted by this time, as the steering levers were incredibly hard to operate, requiring him to put his full weight behind them to get them to even move. Furthermore, the seat, foot brake, and gear lever all had the potential for physical injury to use. In fact, according to Fletcher, if the driver, using the toe of his foot rather than his heel to operate the brake, his foot could slip and get caught, and as a result, the only way to free it was to, quote, saw it off. The officer in charge abandoned the trials right there, stating it was unsafe to continue and that, in his opinion, quote, the entire project should be closed. On top of all that, there were also issues of weight distribution and the 9 inches of ground clearance. And at this point, Germany was well and truly defeated, and considering that the Americans had been busy decorating the bottom of the Pacific Ocean with an overwhelming majority of the Imperial Japanese Navy and Merchant Marine, their days were numbered as well. Thus, with no real need for this new tank and the vehicle itself having many problems, the project was terminated. There was, however, a variant of this vehicle. The Valiant II was mentioned in late 1943, but little more than a name was ever mentioned, as the regular Valiant was barely functional. In February 1944, there was a more detailed discussion on a heavy Valiant, which may or may not have been the same thing. This heavy Valiant was substantially different to the original, only using the turret and driver's compartment of the Valiant, admittedly two of its worst features, on a hull derived from the A38 Excelsior and its T1 suspension. This gave a hull front armor of 9 inches and a turret thickness of 10 inches. Weight for this vehicle was estimated at 42 tons, comparable to the original Excelsior despite almost double the armor, meaning that the tank was likely much smaller than the Excelsior. Power was doubled with the 400 brake horsepower Rolls-Royce Meteorite engine, which was basically a cut-down Meteor that was mated to an improved transmission. One issue that wasn't unique to the Valiant was going to be repeated, this time being a misstep from the Valentine, as the turret could be upgunned to carry a 95mm howitzer like that carried on the Centaur IV, forcing the commander to also act as the loader in the two-man turret. There is a record of a prototype having gone to the Littleworth Cove Ranges for trials in January of 1945, but no record of what it looks like. The sole tank built was retained by the School of Tank Technology, where students are treated to an inspection of it at the end of their course and are invited to find fault. David Fletcher wrote, quote, "One hopes they started early in the morning." This prototype is kept at the Tank Museum in Bovington. And with that, we'll move on to the opinion section. I don't actually hate the Valiant. I don't think it's a terrible looking tank. It's not a very functional tank. If you look at it, I mean, you can just look at it and think, yeah, that's not going to work. That turret is just way too big. But it's not a bad looking tank at all. So at least as far as being a museum static display, hey, it's great for that. What do I think the main problem of this was? And by main problem, I mean like the underlying issue that caused all of the actual problems the vehicle had. And kind of like with the Nassau-class battleships, I don't think this is a situation of the people who designed it being idiots. I think it's actually something else. And in this case, I think it's a combination of the change in designers / production companies, manufacturing companies, the design requirements, and possibly a little bit of the austerity of World War II. Yeah, and just they never got a chance to work the kinks out. Like, I don't think there's one like major thing you can point to. I think it's a combination of many things. Yeah, like there's a lot of background things I think that caused issues. Starting with the change in design and production and manufacturing. I don't know what legwork was done by Vickers and the other company, Birmingham. What was it? Birmingham Locomotive and Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon. Excuse me. Again, I didn't really have time to go and research this super deep. If you want more information on it, I would suggest actually watching David Fletcher's video from Tank Chats, as well as Tank Encyclopedia's article on the vehicle, and just doing some more deep research on it. My videos are kind of like the Spark Notes version, the Wikipedia version, if you will. So they're not super deep, but I don't know if there were any drawings done by Vickers or Birmingham that went to to I can't remember the name of that company now either. Um, Hang on, let me look back at my notes. Ruston and Hornsby. There it is. I don't know what I don't know how far along the project was when it got dumped on them. Um, so it's possible that they like got design requirements and kind of just went. I mean, you don't hear the name Ruston and Hornsby. At least I haven't. I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on British tanks at all. Uh, but I don't hear the name Ruston and Hornsby all that often. They're not always associated with it. With tank design, they probably are quite associated with tank production because everyone was building tanks at the time. But I usually hear Vickers or such when it comes to tank design. Um, yeah, so this might have just been that they never designed a tank before. Uh, it also could be that the design requirements they had, this was just the first iteration, and they were trying really hard to get it right in the first go and just didn't succeed. The design requirements aren't really that strange, um, but you're looking at a vehicle that's supposed to be fighting the Far East and not in Europe, so they're like the design requirements are kind of strange because it's like they want a tank designed to be heavily armored, but they're going up against Japan, and Japan didn't have anything on the battlefield that was really that big of a threat to current British tanks, or indeed the M4 Sherman. Not to say the Japanese tanks weren't a threat at all, because they were, but the design requirements for an infantry tank with that much armor to go up against Japan doesn't make sense. And 27 tons is still really heavy to be used in the Pacific. I mean, the Sherman is a really heavy tank in the Pacific. So it's a little different. And I'm not sure like what requirements, what specifics there were. I don't know if I'm supposed to use a certain type of gun or a certain type of hull or a certain design of whatever. The design requirements, though, are perhaps not the best design requirements for the environment they're going into. I would have designed a tank that was a little bit lighter. Still, a tank as well armored as a Sherman, but lighter. Well, it's an infantry tank, about the same speed that it is, but lighter, and just more ergonomic would have been the design requirements I would have put out if I was the British. I'm pretty sure austerity doesn't need to be talked about that much because it doesn't really seem to be a major factor, but the desire to use parts commonality makes a whole lot of sense at this because they're already building Valentine parts. I don't know why that was ceased. I don't remember. But they didn't do it. So they would have been tooling up production for all of these new parts. And that takes time, and the need was gone by the time any parts could have been, sorted out to make sure that they were designed properly and then tooled up. So even if the tank had finally made it to a point where it would have been serviceable, it probably still wouldn't have made it into combat because it wouldn't have had the chance to tool parts up. And the last bit of it is that they never got a chance to really improve the design. They clearly were working to improve the design, but the design never really went far enough to figure out all of the potential problems, come up with a solution to them, and fix them, and then test them again and repeat that process over and over again until they had a serviceable tank, like most of the vehicles did. Tanks don't just appear out of nowhere. The most famous tank development story has got to be the Tiger, but every single tank that you see in World War II went through some kind of development process. And I think the Valiant just never got past the initial prototype. It wasn't necessarily gone about in the smartest way, but I think had this tank continued to be developed, they would have gotten a serviceable vehicle out of it. I'm not saying it would have been a good vehicle, but it would have been a vehicle that they could use, that could operate. Don't know if it would have been good, but it would have operated. So, yeah, that's kind of my opinion on that. I don't hate the tank. I don't think it's, I don't think it's a poorly designed tank. It's a poorly executed tank is what it is. I don't think it's necessarily poorly designed. I mean, it's got design flaws, but they're design flaws that you would sort out. Like, the flaws here are definitely flaws that someone would have gone in the second or third prototyping phase and said, right, make that turret smaller. Right, we need to make the driving compartment a little bit more ergonomic. Fix X, replace Y, do this, do that. If it had reached that point, so I don't think this is a situation where the designer's an idiot. I think this is just a situation where the tank never got to actually reach its final design potential. But that's my opinion on the Valiant. Trying to think if there's any announcements, but I don't think so. Hey, that's a first. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Check me out on all the things. And I'll see y'all in the next video. Bye.